Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a pretty fascinating and honestly sobering historical case study, drawn straight from Bill Nowlin's introduction to Grigory Maximov's text, The Guillotine at Work. We're going to examine the exact mechanics of how top-down state authority historically clashes with bottom-up, decentralized autonomy. For those of you out there who are actively building, organizing, or living in anarchist communes today, this is absolutely essential history. It's kind of like a masterclass in what happens when the rigid structures of state power collide with genuine grassroots liberation.
Okay, let's jump right into this immediately by looking at this really striking quote. When the Bolsheviks first came to power, one of their initial acts, which was actually done while Vladimir Lenin was absent, was abolishing the death penalty. But according to the text, Lenin's reaction upon his return was to be literally beside himself with indignation. He furiously demanded to know how could a revolution possibly be made without executions. It immediately sets the stage for a fundamental, deep-seated conflict in methodology, right from day one.
And this brings us to a crucial question for anyone building an autonomous community right now. How does a supposedly liberating movement historically transform into an instrument of repression? When you're organizing your commune, you're obviously aiming for collective liberation, right? But the source material asks us to look closely at the historical precedent of a revolution that, instead of empowering local councils, ended up building a massive, centralized machine that completely crushed them.
Section 1. Maximov's thesis on Lenin. Let's look at his core argument.
The text makes a really strongly grounded historical argument that state terror wasn't just some later Stalinist deformation, but that it actually began directly under Lenin. Maximov uses the term political Marxism to describe this. He argues that this approach is inherently counter-revolutionary because it relies on absolute centralization. Think about your modern commune for a second. Imagine replacing all your local consensus meetings with rigid dictates from a distant, single administrator. According to the source, this system inevitably results in state slavery and completely stultifies or crushes the exact freedom and equality that a commune strives for.
Section 2. Subverting the autonomous Soviets.
So the text details the deliberate Bolshevik subversion of organic, worker-led organizing, and it highlights a really fascinating, if grim, tactical maneuver. Lenin brilliantly adopted highly popular anarchist slogans back in 1917, things like "all power to the Soviets," specifically to gain mass support. But once in power, the source notes his path to centralization required subordinating those very same autonomous workers' councils. The state systematically suppressed independent layers of the population and just flat-out destroyed workers' cooperatives, all to bring everything under Moscow's umbrella.
This quote brilliantly illustrates that exact mindset. Lenin stated quite plainly that state power belonged only to his party, and there could be no question of independence for separate groups. Period. Now, for an anarchist commune, independence is kind of the whole point, right? But here we see this completely uncompromising stance that no decentralized independent commune or council could be permitted to exist outside the state's total grip. Section 3. Ukraine and Kronstadt examples. Let's look at how this played out on the ground. To really understand this conflict in reality, the text points us to Ukraine. The Ukrainian peasants, who were led by figures like Nestor Makhno, spontaneously organized, drove out the occupying forces, and actually set up an independent, self-governing region based entirely on free councils. But rather than allowing this autonomy to flourish, Maximov details how Lenin and Trotsky sent the Red Army in to just crush the movement, violently enforcing single-party rule over the entire region.
18,000. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering, tragic estimate of dedicated revolutionary sailors slaughtered in Kronstadt. You see, the sailors of Kronstadt had an unblemished record as the absolute vanguard of the revolution. But the moment they dared to demand free speech, the right to publish, and the right to organize free Soviets without party interference, they were subjected to a brutal military assault. They were wiped out simply for demanding the very autonomy the revolution had promised them in the first place.
This builds with the story of Gavril Myasnikov. The text presents him as this incredibly dedicated worker who spent over 7.5 years rotting in Tsarist prisons for the cause. Yet, when he tried to internally protest that the Bolsheviks were suppressing free discussion, literally warning them that silencing workers just breeds paranoia, what happened? He was expelled, imprisoned, and eventually exiled by Lenin. For any modern collective, it's a really stark example of how centralized structures can view even internal, good-faith demands for basic transparency as a deadly threat.
Section 4. Reinstating capitalist labor mechanics.
For those of you managing labor and distributing resources in your own communes right now, this economic shift is incredibly relevant. Over on the left side here, you have what the workers had originally instituted: collective management, equality of pay, true industrial democracy. But on the right, the text shows us Lenin's state capitalism. He actively reinstated one-man management and a much higher pay for specialists. He even brought back the tailor system. Imagine someone hyper-tracking every single minute of a physical task you do, much like modern productivity tracking apps, right? He used that to enforce capitalist-style iron discipline, all under the guise of running a worker state.
Section 5. The Mechanisms of Terror.
Maximov comprehensively documents that this massive, sweeping shift to absolute state authority required some pretty horrifying enforcement. Based on official Bolshevik statistical summaries compiled in the text, estimates of executions during Lenin's early leadership range from 200,000 up to a staggering 1.5 million. 1.5 million! The sheer scale of the terror directed against political opponents, which, by the way, absolutely included other socialists and anarchists, was just immense.
Enforcing that kind of compliance meant deploying brutal instruments of state repression. We're talking firing squads for anyone questioning the party line. It meant devastating forced grain requisitions from the peasantry that ultimately laid the groundwork for horrific famines. They even went so far as to outlaw labor strikes, twisting the logic to claim that because it was a worker state, going on strike was inherently counter-revolutionary. No way around it. That is a wild mental gymnastic.
And if there is any doubt whatsoever about the intent behind this repression, the text uses this incredibly startling admission from Lenin himself. He explicitly stated that bringing civil war to the village was something they held up as a merit. Actually, let me repeat that: a merit. Terrorizing the peasantry and forcing their compliance wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some tragic accident of wartime chaos. It was a deliberate, proud policy of the centralized state designed specifically to break independent agrarian life.
Section 6. Lessons for Decentralized Communes. So, what should you take away from all this as you work to defend your own decentralized structures today? The source provides some crystal clear historical warnings. Step 1. Always beware the tactical use of libertarian rhetoric by people who actually have authoritarian goals. Step 2. Fiercely defend your local organizing and trade cooperatives from top-down co-option. And step 3, reject what Maximov calls political Marxism. Recognize that substituting your grassroots collective action with top-down state administration historically just strips workers of the very gains they fought so hard for.
I'll leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. You are building communes in a world that, let's face it, often wants to crush them. Based on this history we've just walked through, how will your community defend its autonomy? Not just from the obvious external pressures, but from those who might use the language of liberation while secretly seeking only to command and control. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep building, stay decentralized, but for sure, keep a watchful eye on history.